It was early morning in Sparta, and the dew still clung to the lush grasses on the hillsides of the Eurotas Valley. Along the main road leading out of this small, rustic town, a crowd had gathered. Men, women, and children, young and old, farmers, spinners, blacksmiths, and veterans of war, all were gathered that morning, and a quiet apprehension was in the air. As they looked on, a solitary figure made his way along the path, clutching a staff, almost disappearing from view over the rise. The people of Sparta had said their goodbyes to this man, their leader and lawgiver, and he had made good on his word to leave the city for a time so they could determine their destinies for themselves. They didn't know if they would ever see him again, but the old man who faded from their view, the lawgiver Lycurgus, knew for sure they would not. It was centuries before the famous feats of Sparta's warrior elite against the Persians, and the city had yet to become the great power it would be. Much of Lycurgus's life was a mystery, even to the generations who came after him, as if he were a figure out of myth rather than history. But whatever his origins were, what he did for Sparta became legend, and the laws of Lycurgus would bind his people for ages to come. Equality, unity, justice, simplicity, physical toughness. These were the principles that had guided Lycurgus during his life as a civic leader, who saw he needed to shake the very foundations of the Spartan way of life. To put his nation on the path to greatness, to put an end to greed, selfishness, and the dominance of a select few, he transformed Sparta with radical new laws that made all citizens equal before the law and in the eyes of each other. He had traveled all across the Mediterranean during his life, and even as far away as India, he had broken bread with poets, rulers, and sages, all to determine the best way to organize a human community. And when he returned to Sparta, his time had come to write a new constitution, a set of reforms the Spartans would come to call the Great Rhetra, Lycurgus's proclamation. One of the first things he did was to divide the land into 40,000 small lots, each of them just big enough to keep a family supplied with barley, wine, or olive oil. There would be no vast estates for the rich, or tiny hovels for the poor. Everyone would be equal in their claim on the land, having neither too little nor too much. As for money itself, Spartans would use no gold or silver, only obols, crude, unwieldy bars of iron. 30 pounds worth of iron currency would fill a room and need 2 strong oxen to carry it in a cart. No Spartan would become especially rich, because no one could hoard such wealth and a currency that hard to use. Their couches, tables, and beds would be carved from wood, plain-looking, without expensive cushions or decorations, and the doors and ceilings of Spartan houses would be made of unpolished wood. Lycurgus's laws wouldn't let the people sit at home and eat their own private meals. They would come to public tables and enjoy dinner in the company of their fellow citizens. At each table, about 15 people would sit, and everyone would make a monthly contribution to the public store of barley meal, wine, cheese, and figs, and some iron money to buy meat or fish. Spartan boys would have their hair cut short and went barefoot. As soldiers in training, they slept together in teams on rough beds made of reeds they pulled themselves from the riverbanks. As an institution, their training came to be called the agoge, where they ran races, boxed and wrestled, learned the arts of war and deception, and became brothers in arms. Lycurgus's Sparta would be a nation of warriors, every man an equal in the line of battle, committed to their comrades and to Sparta. The girls would join together in sports too, running, wrestling, and throwing, because physical fitness would make for the strongest mothers of future heroes. Even from birth, Lycurgus's laws would make sure that the Spartans would be strong, even at the cost of human life. When babies were born, they would be judged for any defect, and left out to die if they didn't pass the test. The lawgiver was so confident in the physical strength and courage of the Spartans that he had the city walls torn down to the ground. Sparta's real walls, he said, were its people. These laws didn't come without a backlash. The rich disliked the harsh way in which Lycurgus was making them live and give up their resources. One day an angry crowd attacked him, and he had to find sanctuary on hallowed ground in a temple of the gods. It so happened that a young man named Alcander joined this riot in the streets of Sparta, and when Lycurgus showed himself, Alcander hit him in the eye with a staff. Lycurgus didn't resist, and only stopped, then walked out among the people to show them his bleeding face. When they saw him, they were ashamed of themselves, and seized Alcander to bring him to Lycurgus. They told the lawgiver to punish Alcander any way he wished. In response, Lycurgus ordered him to come with him to his own house, and everyone, including Alcander, expected the worst. But instead, the old lawgiver ordered him to act as his servant, to grab things around the house for him, and wait on him while he worked or ate. And for days this went on, without a single unkind word ever spoken to Alcander. When Alcander finally went home, he told his friends how well he had been treated, and how noble he thought Lycurgus was. And Lycurgus had turned an enemy into an ally, and would make even more allies by a reputation for justice and generosity. When the old lawgiver felt himself getting on in years, he made up his mind to leave Sparta behind. This would be his last act, the end of his mission. He called them all together and said to them, "My friends, I am going to Delphi, to the oracle of the great god Apollo, to speak with him and hear what he would say to me. But before I leave, I wish you all to promise me, leaders and common citizens alike, that until I return to you, you will keep faithfully all the laws I have made, and change none of them until you see me again." The people made their promise. Nothing would be altered until Lycurgus came back to them. And so, on that misty morning in Sparta, Lycurgus said goodbye to his friends and his family, took up his staff and cloak, and set out for Apollo's mountain shrine in Delphi, as the townspeople watched him vanish into the distance. After a long journey, he made it to Delphi, and the oracle told him the answer to his final, burning question, that the laws he had made for Sparta were good and useful. And Lycurgus never did return to his people, living out the rest of his years by himself in foreign lands. He did this for the sake of the land he loved, and just as he had planned, and the Spartans had pledged, they did not change his laws. Some say he died in one place, some in another. Some say he passed away on the island of Crete, and as he lay on his deathbed, he commanded those with him to burn his body and throw his ashes into the sea. And true to their word, they obeyed him. His remains were carried off by the waves, and even in death, no part of him could ever return to Sparta. Such was his confidence in the community he had made, and his trust in the Spartans, who would always respect and observe the laws of Lycurgus.
Chairete Pantes, hello there everyone. Here we have a story from Sparta that explores the origins of the classical city-state and also sums up a lot of the core values of the Spartan system during its height in ancient Greek history. The Spartans are of course a big presence in the modern-day imagination. We only need to think of, how big of a hit the movie 300 was back in the day. And all the Spartan imagery that you still see around, from bumper stickers to sports team logos. This semi-mythical figure of Lycurgus is the founding father of Sparta as we best know it, so there's plenty to dive into here with some extra commentary. Now, Sparta had existed as a state long before the time of Lycurgus, although Lycurgus is the one who is responsible, at least according to tradition, for its social organization and hierarchies and laws and general ideology in the classical period. Sparta had existed all the way back during the Bronze Age, and plays a big role in the legends of the Trojan War, since Helen of Troy, whose going to Troy started the war, was actually the queen of Sparta, and she was married to Menelaus, who then becomes one of the leaders of the Trojan War. Menelaus was the king of Sparta. And not just myth and literature, but also archaeology confirms that the Eurotas Valley in the Peloponnese, where Sparta was, had been settled from a really early date because it's really good land with a nice big river. The so-called Bronze Age collapse happens around the year 1100 or 1000, and then ancient Greek history descends into the Dark Ages, where civilization kind of grinds to a halt for a while. And it's from this period, around supposedly 800 BC, that Lycurgus is alive, and he remakes Spartan society from the ground up. The Laws of Lycurgus were in effect among the Spartans for a long time, all through the period when Sparta is a major power player in Greece, and even long after this when Sparta isn't a major player anymore. Then the laws do become a bit more relaxed. Lycurgus remains a really revered figure, and the old laws are still highly respected. Now, Lycurgus himself is pretty mysterious. In fact, we don't really know if he existed at all, since we have very little information about this character, except for these later semi-legendary tales that are told about him. In a way, he's a bit like the same problem we have with Homer in Greek literature, the alleged author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, for whom there's really no evidence that such a person as a single individual ever existed, despite lots of legendary stories about a Homer springing up. The fullest biography that we have of Lycurgus comes from Plutarch, who is a Greek biographer writing during the Roman Empire. And of course, the issue with Plutarch's account and historical accuracy is that Plutarch is writing all the way during the 2nd century AD. This is fully 1,000 years after Lycurgus is supposed to have existed. So with that in mind, it's a bit difficult for us to know with certainty how much of this is just mythology and oral tradition, and how much of it is really factual. Plutarch is coming at the end of a long tradition of storytelling about this figure from early Greece. Lycurgus was regarded as a sort of sage, a wise man, and as a great lawgiver. He provides a sort of counterpart to another major Greek lawgiver named Solon, who comes a bit later, and is definitely historical. He was living in Athens around 600 BC. As a lawgiver, Lycurgus is also sort of reminiscent of a kind of figure like Moses, who also has a lot of legends around him, and was also responsible for radically reforming his society with a new set of laws. Although Lycurgus didn't found Sparta, he did found a version of Sparta that was incredibly different from what came before. And he does cut the figure of a founding father for the Spartans, a figure who is highly revered for his wisdom and his leadership, whom all the later Spartans look up to as a kind of father figure who guides them. The laws that Lycurgus laid down are sometimes referred to as the Great Rhetra, as you heard in the story, and rhetra in Greek just means a saying or a proclamation, some sort of verbal act. And this refers to the notion that, at least hypothetically, the Spartan constitution was an unwritten constitution, something orally passed down, transmitted by tradition and abided by as a set of customs, of norms to live by. And Lycurgus's constitution is especially notable for the kind of rigorous, very communitarian, very state-oriented, really almost kind of totalitarian style of the reforms that Lycurgus made. It was this idea that the state was preeminent and that the community took precedence over everything to a radical degree. This was not a place where personal desires and individuality and privacy were admired. It was a place where all your efforts should go to the commonwealth of the state, for the hypothetical good of everyone. And this was pretty unique among Greek city-states, even the ones run by very strong central governments. Even among other ancient writers, Sparta was regarded as something really unique and even kind of weird, though not necessarily in a bad way. Some ancient philosophers write about Sparta as if it's a kind of utopian, ideal state, the perfect society where everyone works together for the common good. Now, knowing what we do about Sparta, how it was rigidly hierarchical, how a lot of what we would think of as human rights were denied to the vast majority of people who lived under Spartan control, how kings kept getting exiled because of corruption, how it controlled an enormous enslaved population and committed random acts of violence against them in order to keep them oppressed, stuff like that. With that in mind, I'm not sure if we would share the notion that it was a perfect society. But it was definitely unique and fascinating, that is for sure. That's all for this commentary, but certainly not all to say about the Spartans, so there will be no doubt more stories about them coming out on the channel. Lots of fascinating stuff coming from that culture. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and if any questions or comments or anything to add comes to mind, please do write in. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Take care, see you in the next one, and remember, as a good Spartan would tell you as you go out to battle, come back with your shield or upon it.